I'm excited to be joined by Arthur Breitman, co-founder of Tezos Foundation, Mason Edwards, Chief Commercial Officer, and Roman Schnider, President, for the first ever edition of our State of Tezos quarterly call. On this call, we'll go over several topics around Tezos, including history and background, recent announcements, key technical updates and differentiators, and use cases. We'll wrap up the call looking forward ahead towards the rest of the year around upcoming platform updates and things to look forward to in 2023. A quick disclaimer before we begin. The information contained in this webinar is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. And so with that, let's turn it over to Arthur. Arthur, can you give us a little bit of background about Tezos? What is Tezos and how does it differ from other layer ones?
Yeah, I just want to clarify, I'm not a co-founder of the Tezos Foundation in any respect. I'm a co-founder of Tezos. So how does Tezos differ from any other one? Well, there's many aspects to it, and the one that people are most familiar with is the governance model. If you look at today cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, they've decided that the way to have some form of stability and decentralization is to essentially not really have evolution. Other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum have chosen to evolve essentially under the leadership of a single development team that can essentially call the shots as to what's going on by pushing people into doing hard forks. In Tezos, we have a decentralized model to validate every single upgrade that happens on the chain, and that is a very important aspect. But by itself, it's not what makes it better for application. What makes it better for the application is the fact that the chain has now upgraded 13 times and has always kept with the best of the technology. And I would say that today it probably offers the best scaling solution that's available among L1s. It has a very robust core. The chain has been running continuously without any significant outages since 2018. So it's a very robust chain. It's well written. It has at the forefront of the technology, and it always upgrades. And I think it's found a lot of attraction among developers who like the stability and who likes the flexibility that the chain offers them.
And so, you kind of spoke a bit about the technological differences from other L1s, but turning it over to either you, Mason, or Roman, how do those technological differences impact the user experience and their interaction with the blockchain?
Cool. Who's going to kick us off? Roman, do you want to take a stab?
I'll let you go first, and then I'll chip in as the neutral Swiss one. You have a first go.
Cool, thanks. So I think that it's kind of echoing what Arthur said, right? The fact the chain can upgrade means that you see innovation come a lot more readily to the chain than other competitors in the space. So how does that impact the kind of things we see? Well, it means that we're a place where you can actually get some of the most innovative use cases more readily. I'm excited to see what we get as a result of our scaling solutions. So one of those things could be, for example, gaming. I'm pretty sure that we're going to see some of the best-in-class dApps in the gaming space because they're some of the use cases that benefit the most from our scaling solution. And the other is kind of almost a cultural element that ties into the technology. We had this incredible explosion of creators and artists who are making NFTs on the network. And while that wasn't necessarily because of the enablement of the technology, I think the fact it has this on-chain governance and this decentralization at its core is a philosophy that a lot of people believe in. And it kind of attracts that kind of talent.
And maybe one thing I observed, and obviously, Mason and Arthur can always chip in if they see that aspect differently. I mean, at the end, the growing decentralization, or decentralization, is a process in some sense, and to have a governance model that people start to learn and understand is a very important piece of that decentralization development. And so people, get used of what it means to vote, get used of what it means to be part of something that changes. And technology-wise, one of the things you've seen is because there are regular amendments that are happening now, it also forced the organization to deal with the fact that there are regular software upgrades. How do you create those software upgrades? How do you make sure that the quality for those upgrades continuously meet the expectations, and what tooling is required to have those smooth upgrades? And that's also something we've been able to show for now a very long time compared to other chains.
And so Tezos, in some ways, is actually a blue chip L1 crypto, which is a really funny thing to say given just how young this industry is. But on a relative basis, It is a blue chip. It is, it is one of the first smart contract platforms ever, and a veteran in the industry. And so what differentiates Tezos from a lot of the newer entrants, right? We kind of spoke a little bit to like Bitcoin and ETH, but feels like every day there's a new L1 and L2 coming into the market. And one of the things that you mentioned, Arthur, earlier was the fact that Tezos, or maybe it was you, Mason, Tezos hasn't had any outages since 2018, right? Which is remarkable in light of some of the things that we're seeing around other tokens or other L1s and L2s. So maybe being able to speak to that as well.
So the thing I would say that really distinguishes Tezos from the newcomers is like, we're doing something really stupid. What we're doing is that we're actually building the technology. And, we are in a sea of people who have understood that the way to win in this market is to just overhype everything. And so they just, you look at reports from Henderson Horowitz showing that Ethereum has been proof of stake since 2014. Like they meme themselves into proof of stake. And what we've done is the opposite. We actually are building this as if this technology matters. And that's our biggest difference. So you have a rollup platform on Tezos. It's actually a real rollup platform. It's not controlled by a centralized multi-sig system. It actually has a working fraud-proof mechanisms. We are building these things for real. And if you think that space is going to matter, if decentralization is going to matter, if blockchain is going to matter, then we're doing the real work that's being actually needed to power this. So it's low hype, like there's not much buzz around it, but it's real. And I would say that's what differentiates us in an industry where everything goes on vibes and on hype and like, oh yeah, we're going to have progressive decentralizations. No, we do it for real. We do governance for real. We've seen examples of projects which pretend to have governance and are actually completely centralized in the decision-making where the governance is only indicative. We are bound by the on-chain governance on Tezos. It's for real. The rollups are for real. That's what we're doing differently.
And I think you mentioned like being kind of like a blue chip chain, as I think the words you used. For me, one of the things that stands out there is that you can't write a white paper that brings about reputation. And the reality is that it's been running for a while. It's been running very successfully for a while. It's done multiple upgrades. And, prior to getting the amazing opportunity to join the Web3 space, I spent a lot of my time, with large enterprises. And obviously that's not necessarily the use cases we see today. But what I can say is that as things become big, whether it's a dApp that's a startup that's scaled, or it's a monolithic organization that already exists, if your BAU is to be on chain, then having a chain that's established itself for this kind of period of time and built that reputation is extremely important. And knowing that it will always be at the best in class of technology, or like maybe minus a couple of months to make sure it stays stable, that's a very meaningful reason why people choose to build with Tezos.
And so, Mason, to kind of keep you on the spot there and up, one of the things that, Arthur, you've actually been leading into my questions all along. So this is fantastic. So this is totally not planned, but you mentioned rollups, and let's get into rollups. So Tezos just announced their Mumbai upgrade and subsequently implemented WASM-based rollups, WASM-based optimistic rollups, and plans to introduce ZK rollup options as well. And with that, Tezos will surpass 1 million transactions per second. And so can you speak in simple terms? I know that was a lot of mumble jumble for a lot of people listening, but in simple terms, what is a rollup? What does this mean? And why is having such high TPS important? And like practically, what does that actually enable?
Okay, so a few elements. If you look at traditional blockchains and L1s, you have validators, right? And they do several things. They work in the consensus algorithms, they execute the operations, they download all the data. So they have these different roles. The idea of a rollup is to outsource the execution of the transaction somewhere else while keeping the chain secure. And it's, do not ask your validators to execute. Let other people execute it, but then make sure on chain that the execution is correct. And if you can do that, you have a rollup mechanism. And so since your execution is outsourced, you can afford to have much, much higher throughput without putting, I would say, too strong of a burden on the validators of the network. So it's a scaling solution, which doesn't involve more trust assumption than you have before. And that's, I would say, is the beauty of it, as opposed to people who suggest scaling by creating sidechain with bridges. You always have a centralized element here. This is not the case, not with rollups. Now, why do we need this type of throughput? If you look at the type of applications that you see today in blockchains, they are very, very centered around use cases where you have few transactions. And part of that is because people know that a lot of applications they could build, which would have a lot more throughput, they wouldn't even fit, right? And so if you have an application that requires 100,000 transactions per second, you're not even going to try to build it on a blockchain because you know it's just not going to handle it. As a result, a lot of the industry has focused on applications where the value of a single transaction is very high. So that's finance use cases, gambling use cases. You know, it's like the value per user is extremely high. Once you start having 1 million transactions per second, you have much, much cheaper transaction, but also like the capacity of having way more. It changes the type of applications you can build. And there's a lot of applications we've never seen before that I think can be built on blockchains if they have this like much larger throughput. One general category, without going into specifics, I think it's important for games. You know, if you want to have a real-time game where the interaction with the blockchain happens in real time, as opposed to just having collectibles on the side that's you sometimes trade, that's very important. But generally speaking, there's one use case for these blockchains, which is something very similar to applications. It's kind of like a sort of batteries included way of building web applications. You build your web application, but you know what? It's going to come with payments, and it's going to come with state management, and it's going to come with authentication. All of that gets a little bit built in, and that's convenient. And if you don't have to pay very large fees for this, that's very important. Now, you might say, well, fees can be only pennies, but if fees are pennies, and you have tens of millions of users, and you want to pay the fees for your users, that gets very expensive. So truly, if you get into the fraction of the pennies, is when you unlock this new use cases.
And in terms of languages, is something that Mason brought up here in the comments. What are the different languages that developers can use?
So for building on rollups, or rollups are based on WASM. So anything that compiles to WASM you can use. WASM is a new backend that's gained a lot of popularity in the past decade, and so languages like Rust, for example, can be compiled to WASM. Languages like Go, Python also is building compilation to WASM. So pretty much any language, any tool chain that you can use today or tomorrow is going to have some ways of being compiled to WASM. So you're really able to build with any tool. For a long time, the blockchain world had a lot of idiosyncratic language. Tezos uses Michelson as its backend, and Lego and SmartPy as those languages. We've seen Solidity on Ethereum. All of this, in some sense, even the things that have gotten some traction, they're still tiny specs compared to the use of much larger languages with much larger code bases. And so it really opens up to any programmer the ability to build these rollup applications.
And so you spoke specifically about TPS, and I kind of led you down that rabbit hole. But what are the other benefits of Mumbai that we should know about? I mean, and also is TPS really a differentiator in the long run, or how do you kind of think about that? Because there are a lot of blockchains that are at least talking about having very high TPS numbers, but it sounds like it's something you guys are actually going to accomplish this year.
Yeah, again, there's a difference between people who talk about it and people who actually do it. We're the idiots who actually do it. But in terms of does it matter? Yeah, I think it makes a difference because there are some applications you can build with those that you cannot build with lower TPS. So it does make an important difference. It's qualitatively different application. It's not like, oh well, if people were if the fees were really high, then maybe you should have like 10% more block space. No, it's just like some applications are just simply not possible using existing blockchain, and they become possible with this type of things. Now, there's other things in Mumbai. I think there was a reduction in latency. So we went from 30-second block to 15 seconds, which is quite high. Still, I would say there's a big goal this year for a lot of engineering team working on Tezos to reduce it down to a few seconds. So that's that's the next big piece of work after scaling. But we figured that focusing on scaling as opposed to latency initially was more important given the demands from the market.
And so, we spoke a lot about why Tezos is different from other L1s and kind of the benefits of Tezos. But when those from the outside are kind of looking in at Tezos and they're evaluating the blockchain, or maybe the successor Mumbai or some of the different initiatives that you guys are undertaking, what are the different metrics that you think that they should be looking into, right? Wait, somebody from the outside looking in, if you're like, this is what you should actually be looking at when evaluating Tezos, what kind of immediately comes to mind?
I say this is like hard metrics, but I would say that the right decision shouldn't be just based on numbers. There's a lot of intangibles which matter. The company you keep is, I think, quite important, actually, because people judge projects based on the chain that they're on. And we've seen chains which were really set up for success in terms of like the go-to-market and everything, and that didn't succeed because they were soiled by, to be honest, like dirty use cases. So the company you keep, the developer community around it, those are intangible, like how easy to find tools, how easy to build. Those are not hard metric, which but they matter a great deal. But if you want to go into metrics, I would say what is the throughput, what is the latency, how reliable is a chain, how often does it experience outages, these type of things.
And so moving over to you, Roman, one of the things that was talked about earlier was kind of this, this idea of on-chain and self-amendment governance. Can you talk about in a little bit more depth what that means and how it's helpful for the network and how it's actually brought together market participants on the network? And one of the things that I think Arthur said earlier was that that's helped prevent hard forks. Can you explain why that actually has helped prevent hard forks?
And going to Arthur, who kind of started on it already, and I can have a first go, keeping in mind that I'm not a tech person, right? But I think, again, right, one of the very initial concept of having that governance process that allows to amend the chain and also introduces a process on how to obviously introduce changes, vote on those changes, and have I would say something like a political process around those changes. Do you want them? Do we need them? And do we do and how will it help us going forward? There is a qualitative and a technical factor that I see on the tech side. There is a clear process on how to get from one state to the next one that is defined. On the qualitative side, it allows you to build up a culture of submitting change, think about change, vote about it, and then process it. Maybe technically, Arthur, you'd be better placed to talk about the on-chain process than I am. So I'll maybe pause here.
Technically speaking, it's fairly simple. It's a voting procedure based on coins. The point is that most of the risks that you have around upgrades are around social capture, right? You're not running a terrible risk if you're upgrading your software and making it better. That somehow you're going to disenfranchise people. However, technical upgrade could be used to disenfranchise people, and you don't want to do that. And so the governance role in Tezos is mostly to ensure that we don't have bad things happen, and that's an easier problem to solve in some sense than trying to say, oh, we want to make sure we always pick the best upgrade. It's not so much about that. And so once you know that's what you're trying to do, you can solve for that by having, for example, very high threshold. So you have an 80% acceptance threshold for governance proposals on a Tezos blockchain. Why? Because if something is really good, then it should be obvious to everyone that it's really good. And if something cannot convince 80%, then maybe it's not worth going into that rabbit hole. That's the general idea. But I would say, Tezos is not about the governance, it's about what governance has enabled. And what governance has enabled is to remain decentralized, but at the same time to remain agile in terms of how the protocol can evolve.
And so a lot of the, obviously you guys were one of the early pioneers of governance, but we've seen a lot of other protocols roll out governance, particularly, using EVM, whereas you guys have opted for your own smart contract language, Michelson. Can you kind of speak about, the advantages of doing that and not being reliant on Solidity and EVM?
Solidity and EVM didn't really exist when Tezos was built. So it's not like we went out and says we're going to be different from Ethereum. It's just like we're contemporaneous to Ethereum. I don't think the EVM is particularly good. Look, there's basically two ways I would say you build a virtual machine for a smart contract platform. One way is you try to optimize the virtual machine for the use case, and that's what we try to do with Michelson. And Michelson, if you want to build small contracts and make them extremely efficient and extremely safe, is a great language for that. It's a great language if you want to prove properties about your contract. It's a great language if you want to have this very, very concise small contracts that you can build. The other approach is you can go with what is very standard. Like you can pick a standard assembly language. You could pick like RISC-V, you could pick WASM, you could even pick x86. And the benefit from that is that you inherit an entire tool chain and an entire set of tools. And that's basically the approach we're taking with the rollups. With the rollups, we're saying, you know what, you're in a very standard world. None of this is exotic. You can build anything you want. And the EVM is in between. The EVM is like it's an assembly language, so that you have the risk, I would say, and the lack of interpretability you get from assembly without actually being standard. So you can do the worst of both worlds. But Ethereum was the first smart contract platform that really shipped, and as a result, I would say like the EVM became popular. But it's also easy to overstate the dominance of Solidity. There's a report by H3 Capital that mentions something like 5,000 part-time developers working on Solidity in the world. It's a tiny number. It may be more than any other like language for blockchains, but don't look at the relative. Look at the absolute. In the absolute, it's a tiny number.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I mean, that's like a smaller number of developers that have gotten laid off from a lot of these tech companies in recent layoffs in the grand scheme of things. So I think that's fair. So one of the other things that Tezos offers is baking or validation. So can you kind of speak about what that process is like and how somebody actually becomes a baker on Tezos and how many there are?
Mason, you want to take it? Roman? I can take it, but...
I mean, I can certainly talk a little bit about it. Maybe I can talk to it in the context of the recent announcement that happened with Google.
Perfect. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, I think what was super interesting there is that to some extent, Google Cloud and, the Tezos ecosystem or the spirit of Tezos, if you will, are very similar in that there's a culture of engineering excellence that goes between all the dApps and all the efforts I see on Tezos and obviously at Google. And so again, that was kind of the bridge of communication for us to start having a conversation with the foundation and them. From that, obviously Google cares a lot about infrastructure. Google Cloud's been a strong push in that direction, and supporting Web3 infrastructure is an amazing next step. So one of the ways that they started to do that was to become a block producing validator. So that's underway. And I think that's a very meaningful step for them to take. And also one that I imagine isn't just for them. It's something I see them offering out to their big Rolodex of very important institutions who will also want to onboard into the Web3 space and start to learn more about this technology. So that's some pretty exciting news, and there's probably some more to come. Can't share too much now. But for them, it was a pretty easy process. It's not difficult to become a validator on Tezos. And I think if we want to go into the details, I'm sure Arthur can take us there, but there's plenty of how-tos and it takes maybe 15 minutes and one roll.
One thing I would add is that we've always kept the requirements, the technical requirement for being a baker to be, the hardware requirement to be very low. And so people bake on Raspberry Pis, which are this $20 computer you can buy. So it's always been a goal to be as decentralized as we can be, and that means making it accessible for people to validate on a network.
So I think this is actually a great time to kind of shift the conversation from a more technical nature to focusing a lot more about adoption and partnerships. So I think Google is a great example that you just gave, Mason. But another example recently is the California DMV using Tezos to issue vehicle titles as NFTs. So why did that happen? Can you kind of speak about like what was the benefit of actually bringing that process on chain, and why did the California DMV choose Tezos?
Cool. One for me. Great. Absolutely. So, it's a little bit of a poor analogy. But I think that people are starting to look at Web3 and sort of realize that maybe this is a bit like Web2 when they weren't sure if they should have a website. Now they're starting to ask the question of, well, what should we be doing in the Web3 space? How should we be innovating our business? What do we need to do to basically not get left behind here? And it's amazing to see that the DMV are kind of one of the first to step up and look at that in a very meaningful way. But we've seen it from other institutions of a similar nature, like La Poste in France. In terms of the actual use case, there's plenty of blog posts out there that can take you through a little bit more of the detail. But the easiest way to think of it is NFTs as car titles. And so, it's not clear exactly what value that's going to bring in every meaningful way. But it seems to me pretty obvious that it's a vast improvement on a paper system especially a paper system that's been historically troubled by fraud. So, I think it's a very strong first step to start to uncover a little bit more about what value exists in that space. But I don't want to spoil too much of their plans before they get the chance to announce them themselves.
So I think with partnership broadly, it's kind of an interesting question of, how do you go about actually educating and attracting people to build on Tezos, like from a commercial perspective, right? Because there's obviously benefits to use the chain, especially now, as we alluded to earlier, now that it's moving to, 1 million transactions per second. So pretty much any use case is possible at 1 million. I mean, that's a large amount of transactions. So how do you actually go about having these conversations and in simple terms, explain what the benefits of building on Tezos are?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say about that is it kind of echoes back to the BAU comment I made earlier. If you have a serious business that wants to make a serious move in this space, then you want to pick a very serious chain. And you want to pick one that's serious because of its design, but also because of its reputation of providing upgrades, being stable. In terms of the relationships that then form thereafter, one of the amazing things about this ecosystem is that a lot of the time, I wake up and my job's done for me. There's system integrators, there's engineers who care about this space, and we can often not even know that someone's going to build something on Tezos. So that's always my favorite way for BD to happen, because I get to look at other things all day. But on the other side of the coin, there's a very wide community, and the foundation does a lot to support different adoption entities, different engineering entities around the world, and they sometimes obviously get reached out to as well. And the decision criteria just goes back to what I said before, that they've seen us as a very meaningful player in the space. They've seen this as a very reliable place to build. And so we take the conversations from there and we demonstrate that that's true. We actually have the technology to back up our claims. And from that, we tend to get the really cool use cases.
And you mentioned before that Tezos is kind of like the blue chip out there, so it kind of has been here for a long time. And that's also something, looking back, that is interesting to see. 24 or even more months back, more conversations were about certain infrastructure matters like block explorers, wallet qualities, or wallet features. And then, you start to think about additional features for wallets, and the complexity of the application layer kind of grows. So I just say, just by the fact that we've been active for quite a long time, the quality of the tooling and therefore also the dev experience is such that people can start very easily and actually go for their projects and have that basis they need as well. So the maturity of the tooling certainly helps as well. And looking at the last parts of the journey, there was, you get into more for profit type activities, and comes to our focus areas on gaming, the arts and collectible space, and on the DeFi side, where it obviously goes specifically into certain areas and say, okay, let's look at gaming. So what type of integrations, what type of tooling, what type of needs do we have now for gaming? And those specializations certainly also helped in the go-to-market.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Roman, to echo the tooling. I feel like one of the things that we do is we watch what's evolving in this space. Blockchain's got a lot of ideas around it, a lot of interest and opportunity. And it's these few use cases that very meaningfully stick as time goes by. It's one of the reasons we have such a prolific art vertical. But also as we start to see things like fan engagement and consumer engagement become very meaningful, then we can start to help encourage the right tooling to make that possible. And that's just a continuous flywheel that brings more of the meaningful use cases to the ecosystem.
So perfectly leading into my next question again, so thank you guys, which was going to be about, Tezos has become a very preeminent train as it relates to creators coming on chain and building NFTs with a specific focus on generative art. And so how did that kind of come to be? How have you gone and supported creators, and why are they choosing to build on Tezos specifically?
You can tell me, we can see many stories around there. It's not immediately obvious what was factorizing was the confluence of factors. I would say that a lot of them got started on Ethereum in 2021. there were several issues on Ethereum. The fees were very high. Ethereum was a proof of work platform, so which was consuming a lot of energies, and there were not really many alternatives to Ethereum that was satisfying for artists. You had chains like Solana, which were being funded by by defrauding FTX depositors. You had chains like Polygon, which were completely controlled by a single multi-sig. None of these are good places to actually mint art. None of these are good places to collect pieces you want to collect for the next 20 and 30 years. And I would say Tezos embodied an ethos of decentralization, of seriousness. People liked it. There was also the Higednunk platform. So 1 billion developer built Higednunk, which was a really open place for artists to express themselves and create NFTs. And that platform really took off. And then it seeded a lot of other projects on Tezos, such as Theia, Object.com, and then later we saw FXhash. And progressively this community built itself because I think that they recognize themselves in the values embodied by the network. I would say we've always tended to be serious and not pander. And not pandering into a lot of the silliness of 2021 and 2022, I think attracted more serious use cases. And as a result, this is a use case which has grown in the middle of a bear market, because this is not about people speculating on tokens. This is about people creating beautiful art and collecting art and supporting artists. And that's why we build for real, because we want real applications that are going to have some staying power.
I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is the type of art on Tezos is different than that on many other chains, and that there's really a focus on generative art. It's not a lot of the same profile pictures. It's actually really beautiful. I mean, I'm on object.com now, and you can go look at a bunch of the other Tezos NFT marketplaces. Why do you think generative art do you think there's a reason that has become such a big kind of community on Tezos specifically, or do you think it just happened to be that those are the first few artists that came over?
I think it's quite viral. I think community begets community, right? So when a few people lead the charge, and for us, that was FXhash driving the initial community there after some excellent work in Theia and Higednunk and all of the others. That kind of invites more people. We've had, I think, for the longest time running, though I don't know the recent statistics, I think the 5th top social volume on Twitter. But what's even more amazing is when you go through that, that's not communications about Tezos or in an abstract way or about movements of tokens. That's about artists wanting to encourage other artists to join the platform and how to work with FXhash and how to make greater art. So I think that's the thing. The more you put into a community, the more you get out of it. The generative side kind of makes sense because obviously it's a blockchain, so there's a technical component to it, and generative artists obviously sit on that lovely intersection of people who are quite technical but also artists.
I would say there's also a specific story. My background is in AI, and I remember when I was working for Waymo in 2016, and I became a fan of this artist Quasimodo or Mario Klingemann, who was doing art using GANs, generative adversarial network. And I was fascinated because they were really, really cutting edge technology. And he was an artist, but he was actually building his own and working with his own cutting edge technology. And I thought, wow, that's super cool. I need to collect this because, this is going to be very, very big. And I realized, well, because most of his art was digital, it was not a great way to collect it. And so I started following him on Twitter and, for a few years. And when art and NFTs started having a moment, I spoke with him and I said hey, you should try minting on Tezos. We have a great platform. And, he started minting on Tezos and he brought an entire community of generative artists. So I would say that was also a big, there's a bit of a founder effect here with Quasimodo coming to the chain and bringing a lot of talented people. What's also wonderful about a lot of generative artists is they're also programmers or coders, so they also build applications and they've built a lot of things in the ecosystem.
And so another area of NFTs, which I think is, I would say it's more nascent, is music NFTs, right? It's something that has kind of been talked about a little bit for the last few years, but I know it's something that Tezos is focusing on specifically. So would love to kind of hear your thoughts on music NFTs broadly, what the benefits of music NFTs are, and how you kind of see that area evolving on Tezos.
Well, music is a form of art that's probably consumed the most by people. I would say maybe followed by movies and a few others. But by and large, people consume a lot more music than they consume visual arts. It's probably the most popular form of art today. And also people love collecting music. People have always, collected, had these huge music collections. But today, a lot of the joy of collecting music is going away, with music being digital, with music being streamed. You don't even have your files. And I think we have a bit of a collector instinct. We want to own a piece of something. And it's not been cracked yet. We haven't really seen music NFTs being produced. We've seen music NFTs around music, not as many around about NFT. There are platforms like DNS.xyz, for example, which have real music NFTs, which are which contain the music, but it's still fairly new, and I think it's still the most untapped potential in the collectibles market.
Is another thing also interesting to mention that, the collecting aspect of it is one, and the other one I feel like is the supporting aspect. And you hear that quite often, right? I mean, that it feels very direct if you support an artist when you buy an NFT. Obviously, you have the same effects when you do that on an art piece and a music piece. And so looking at it from an ecosystem perspective, how do you get an ecosystem, or how do you activate an ecosystem? Sometimes it really means that these groups can start to enable each other, and that's there are wonderful exercises or examples, that we've seen on Tezos where exactly this happens, and that is something that fascinates me as well. That directness of support. I have an artist that is somewhere in the US, and normally I would never have the chance to interact with that artist directly, but now I can, and you can feel those effects as well.
Kind of staying on the NFT train for a final question, which is, you guys have partnered with both Man U and McLaren and have hundreds of thousands of users, if I'm not mistaken, which have participated in those fan engagement programs and received NFTs. And so how do you kind of see the role of sports collectibles as an engagement mechanism for different sports teams? How do you see that evolving? And has it kind of, have you seen practical use cases of that being a really great way for teams to engage with their fans?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's even a factor of 10 more successful than that. So it's definitely one of those use cases where, like I said, you're kind of going through time, and then these use case by use case, they tend to stick, and that's the really meaningful ones to start to see. And I think fan engagement, and also in a very similar vein, kind of engagement with your consumers as a brand, is definitely starting to become one. So, some of the things we've seen recently is that it takes a bit of time to work out exactly what the right way to do it is. But McLaren have started doing a few 100,000 NFT collections per race. There's 23 races in a season. And what we're also seeing is really strong retention from race to race. So it means that people aren't just collecting an NFT and going away. They're collecting multiple NFTs and starting to build, a collection and becoming part of the engagement with the sport through that. They then interact with those collections and other people who have similar things in Discord. It creates a secondary market for these things. So that's been a really nice example of how you can start to build community around a Web3 project as a brand. Obviously, the Manchester United key drop was a massive success, followed up by their PFP, which is obviously more of a community engagement tool in and of itself by nature. But what's nice is these use cases have kind of shown the art of what's possible in a backdrop of other projects on other chains that haven't really aged particularly well. And we're starting to see a lot more clubs and a lot more sports institutions who really just want help understanding how the technical integration could work and how they could become part of this future of fan engagement. And that's always exciting to see kind of a use case in a micro industry grow.
So one of the things that Arthur alluded to earlier is, a million TPS enabling gaming as being one of kind of those core use cases. And I know that you guys have already made a bunch of partnerships within the gaming space. One of the challenges with gaming is that a AAA game takes years to make, which I don't think people realize, in that, you might ahead of time have been working on this, but kind of how do you envision or see the gaming, space take hold on Tezos, how long is that going to take? Are we talking that we're going to start seeing real games hitting the market in 2023? Is it a few years from now? And how do you envision kind of somebody starting as a gaming user on Tezos and then kind of diving in and becoming more involved with the ecosystem on a holistic level?
A lot of very simple games have also had a lot of users. Sometimes it's not necessarily the most polished games that people are playing the most. I mean, it's not necessarily a good blockchain game, but if you take, Wordle, for example, Wordle was a very, very simple game, not a lot of development, and hundreds of millions of users. So sometimes, it's small things can make a huge difference. But you raise an interesting question, which is how many of these users are basically going to be using the game and not necessarily using other part of the ecosystem? How do they become users of the chain as opposed to user of a game in particular? And that's something I think about a lot, because I think our goal is to bring as many people using the chain overall and not like using a specific application on the chain. But there's a lot of there's a lot of opportunities here, because once you have a wallet, and I think it's probably one of the hardest part of the onboarding for users in this space, and it's one area where we've actually done a lot of progress and made it very easy, which was important for some of the sports partnership you mentioned, to have like very easy onboarding. Once you onboard people, once they have a wallet, once they're used to making a transaction, all of these other applications becomes easier to access. They become more natural to access, and they can interoperate. So, all of a sudden you say, well, maybe I got an NFT somewhere. Hey, you know what? I'd like to sell it, or I'd like to buy another one that I wasn't able to collect. Now you're going to a marketplace. So little by little, and it's something we saw with the menu drop, for example. So Manchester United dropped a lot of keys on people, and some keys were rarer than others. And there was a following drop, and a lot of fans of Manchester United went in and actually traded their keys to get the other type of keys so that they could participate in drop. And they were people who had really never used a blockchain application before, but they figured out a way to do it because they wanted to participate in a drop. And in so doing, they were using object.com, for instance. So we see this type of activity takes place and cross-pollination between different applications.
And so, another kind of final area to hit on, and then would love to kind of ask you guys, your expectations for Tezos this year and what you care about. But my final question is, one of the things that we're seeing kind of across the board is this idea of enterprise use on chain, as well as real world assets, and the idea that, basically tokenizing traditional assets and bringing them on chain. And we've seen a number of partnerships, even some this morning, and on other chains, and some things specifically on Tezos as well. How do you kind of think about that this idea of tokenization broadly and bringing that to Tezos? And is that a core area of focus for you?
I think tokenization, so the STOs that we've seen, they've started relatively early already. And, one element of it is, you kind of start to think on how you can, how can a token kind of, refer a certain real world asset, what are the legal frameworks you need, etc. And that's at the very beginning, right? And then you kind of start to think about, okay, what type of standards or these institutions or tools they need in order to actually, standardize those processes. So you start to work on certain standards that STOs become more relevant. But then, and we touched on that a couple of times already, right? There is always the angle of, can I tokenize it? Is it actually, are we able to create a token that references a value, versus what is actually the value add when you do these type of tokenizations? And then you get into also legal discussions. What can I do with it? I have a token that references some real estate project. Can I use it as a collateral now? Or I have the share from my company as a security token. And in Switzerland, for example, that's now possible by law. So you can have your company's security reference as a token, but then what you do with it. And so that value add that starts to be created as well is a step-by-step process, and it involves the lawmakers as well that have to think what is possible, and that's what I find interesting. But the tokenization itself, I find, is not actually the real hurdle with many of those tokenization projects. It's what you then gain as a value add on top of it. And you know, I mean, going back to one thing you said, Arthur, before when we talked about gaming, the user experience, for example, is key, right? It's really fantastic that you know, people can do something they sometimes don't even feel that there's a Web3 element to it, right? But then if you go too far, people wouldn't even notice that they actually have a wallet. And so in that kind of analogy, you can start to tokenize. There are standards, you know, and STOs may become simpler, but you need to rethink those processes that will create the value chain. And that's interesting. And we're seeing that, you know, another example will be the DMV project that we discussed before. You can start to tokenize car titles. Maybe in the future, there will be a possibility to think about car financing. Maybe initially it's just a possibility of you know, transferring data between states in an easier and more secure way. And these, so these building blocks, in this logic of building blocks, I think like these real world asset tokenizations are one step, one initial step you need.
So we've spoken a lot about kind of retrospective on what Tezos has done recently, what it kind of accomplished in Q1 and in last year. But I'm curious, is my last and final question. So I'd love if we kind of went around to everyone here. What are you most excited for Tezos throughout the rest of 2023? What should we be, you know, looking out for, you know, both for Tezos, but also for crypto more broadly? And maybe we could start with you, Roman, and then Mason, and finish off with Arthur.
Well, I think for me, the excitement is really how the scalability angle now starts to be adopted. Now it's here, and we're already hearing many projects talking about the new abilities. But that means, you know, you need to start building, and to see that come to life, to see the first use cases is what excites me most at the moment.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and I would double down on the ability to onboard more developers who don't necessarily speak a smart contract language. You know, so the fact we can onboard developers who can work with Rust, you know, suddenly we've very quickly gone from, like Arthur mentioned, a few thousand people in, you know, what is otherwise a nascent ecosystem across all of blockchain to millions of developers who can now start to build things. So really, it's time to wait and see what they come up with.
Yeah, and I would say, I'm going to repeat myself, but I would say we have new use cases which are opening with Scale, and I think seeing those new use cases and seeing how Scale can be used is, I think, something I look forward to. That, and also like there's a lot of improvements for this protocol in the pipeline around latency and around other aspects, and I'm really eager to see them at work.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. This is great. I actually learned a ton, as I'm sure a lot of others did. I saw there were some comments in the questions about, is this recorded? Absolutely, it is recorded. We will have it up. It should be live very shortly, and we'll be providing a summary of the call as well for anybody who wants to access that. And so with that, thank you to all of you guys for joining, and I'm excited to do this again next quarter.
Thank you, Josh.